Thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about evolution of regulations in nanotechnology. In this session, I'm going to be going through nanomaterials, what they actually are defined as. I'm also going to be taking a good look at pathways of entry into the skin, because that's a very important aspect to understand when you're considering the safety of nanomaterials in personal care products. I'm going to be taking a look at the regulations covering nanotechnology and nanomaterials, some of the latest scientific findings, what to tell marketing and consumers if they're concerned about nanomaterials in your products, and some novel formulation ideas to help you get enhanced efficacy from your formulations. The definition of nanomaterials is an insoluble or biopersistent substance with one or more external dimensions or internal structure between 1 and 100 nanometers. That's the official definition of a nanomaterial. But it's subject to a lot of untrue scaremongering, and I'm going to show you the facts in a moment so you understand why a lot of what is out there is just not correct. The untrue scaremongering that is on the internet and circulating is that these substances can actively penetrate the epidermis and dermis due to their relatively small dimensions, and it's just not true. So let's take a look at that, and the regulators are picking up speed on this as well, and they also support the safety of these materials. In this slide, I've tabled out some of the size and the dimensions to give you relative comparisons so that you can see just how difficult it is for these substances to be absorbed. So for a substance to be absorbed through a hydrophilic, a water-loving pathway, a water-soluble substance, it needs to be smaller than 0.4 nanometers. So that's actually out of the scope of the definition of a nanomaterial straight away. Remember, nanomaterials are 1 to 100 nanometers in dimension. So if you have a water-soluble substance that can actually penetrate through the epidermis through a hydrophilic pathway, it's actually smaller than a nanomaterial anyway. If you are looking at lipid-soluble substances, they need to be 13 nanometers or smaller. And again, I'll show you some graphs in a moment of the nanomaterial size distribution. And you'll see that even if you have a nanomaterial, only a small number of those materials would actually be smaller than 13 nanometers if it is in fact lipid soluble. So again, very difficult for these substances to actually traverse the skin. The intercorneocyte space, and I'll show you some diagrams in a minute, some pictures to demonstrate the intercorneocyte space, is 20 to 75 nanometers. Again, so we're talking about very small pathways to entry. And just to put this into perspective for you, even if a nanomaterial could traverse the outer layers of the epidermis, it then needs to travel 10,000 to 40,000 nanometers to get to the dermis. That is like having 1 meter, a substance that's 1 meter in size, then travel at least 1 to 4 kilometers to actually get to the dermis. So even if it can get through the outer layers of the epidermis, it still has a very, very long way to go before it can get to the dermis. And even then, it typically gets stopped there. But I'll tell you about that in a moment. So again, in this slide, I'm just putting into words what I just talked about in that last table. So water-soluble substances need to be smaller than nanomaterials to traverse the stratum corneum. Lipid-soluble substances can travel through lipid bilayers when they're smaller than 13 nanometers. The intercorneocyte space to actually get between cells, 20 to 75 nanometers. Even if they can pass, they still have an incredibly large distance to travel before they can get to the dermis. Just to put this into pictures, because this speaks more than 1,000 words. This is a typical example of skin layers: stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basale, and the dermis. So this is typically 10,000 to 40,000 nanometers in thickness, depending on the region of skin. And this is again another little diagram here. This is just showing the very outer stratum corneum, and this is what we're talking about, the intercorneocyte space here. If you're looking at pathways into the skin, it's not just the size but the chemical that also matters. Most substances are stopped at the stratum corneum. This includes your water-staining dyes, water-soluble substances, lipids, and lipids on the skin are actually desirable to help prevent transepidermal water loss. At the stratum granulosum level, now this is desirable if you want a product to have good efficacy, especially if you're including osmolytic agents like humectants. They can be pulled and pull small substances into the stratum granulosum level. So back to this slide here, you can see that's about this level here. And this is where you start to get good activity of your actives within the skin. One of the biggest challenges that formulators actually have is getting active substances in deep enough to do their job, which is again why it's quite laughable when we see all this ridiculousness that is on the internet about how dangerous nanomaterials are. We want to try and get actives into the skin, and these are small materials. So our challenge is to get them into the skin. It's really hard to get actives into deeper layers. So what's the big concern about nanomaterials? Because they just can't get there. Even if they do, they still get activated upon. And I'll go through that again in a moment for you. At the stratum basal, this is where we want very small actives, and they're usually delivered in nanoemulsion base with osmolytic agents. The osmolytic agents help draw them to the stratum granulosum. And if they're in a nanoemulsion, they can then travel potentially further into the stratum basal. And that's where you want your actives to go. They start to then communicate and get some of your high efficacy results you're looking for. Here again, just to put size into perspective, this is showing droplets of an emulsion at 1 micrometer. Down here, 150 to 200 nanometers. So we're talking about extremely small substances. And again, for good delivery, we want to create nanoemulsions to help deliver our actives into the deeper layers of the epidermis, but they stop there. This is another diagram showing the intercornea site space. Again, just to give you a size perspective, this is just the very outer layers of the epidermis. So just the very outer layers are represented in that diagram. I hope you can start to see the size. You know, it's just very difficult for these materials to actually travel far enough to even reach the dermal layer. Most importantly, even if a cosmetic substance does get to the dermis, you then have an immune response. Macrophages in your dermal layer will typically pick up foreign matter and remove it from your body. Pharmaceutical substances, injectable substances, these are obviously designed to get deeper into the bloodstream, but they're not cosmetics. I'm here today talking about nanomaterials in cosmetics, products that are applied topically to unbroken skin. We're not supposed to be advertising these products for injection. We're not supposed to be advertising these products to use on broken skin. So there's some of the concern comes from when materials are used in those cases, but that's not the normal or typical use for a cosmetic substance. That's not how they're supposed to be used. So let's have a look at some of the regulations now. What do the regulators say? Initially, there was a lot of confusion and there was prohibitions, and it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but let's face it, the regulators are there to help ensure consumer safety. So until they know better, they're going to be cautious. And that's good. We want that. We want to be able to use cosmetics and know and assume that they're safe to use. Now, however, they've taken a studied and scientific approach to safety evaluations and suitable reporting. They've acknowledged that nanomaterials generally cannot penetrate the dermal layer, and I'll mention some studies later where they've actually demonstrated this. And they've also demonstrated that even if they can reach the dermal layer, they are typically acted on by macrophages or found in such small amounts that they would be insufficient to cause any harm. And again, that's got a lot to do with the size, the tiny size of the material compared to the huge distance they have to travel. That just such a small amount, even if it did get across that dermal layer, even if it does pass the macrophage immune response, that there's such small amounts left that it's insufficient to cause any harm. Work on this area is ongoing, and again, it's a good thing. because we want to make sure that our products continue to be safe. And at the same time, we want to make sure we give consumers the best products we can. So we're going to continually look for ways to get our actives into the deeper layers of the epidermis for the best results. We want the regulators to keep checking it for us, but right now, the science, the evidence, the regulators are saying they're safe to use. This is an example of a distribution curve. So particle distribution curves are required as part of a product information file for registration in EU. Nano-sized ingredients need to be written on the label. They need to be identified with the INCI name and then nano in brackets. And as part of the product information file, you need to supply the particle size distribution curve in that file so that the regulators have the information should something go wrong or something be reported in the marketplace. They can then find this information in the product file. In Australia, there was a lot of work done on titanium dioxide and zinc oxide, and it was found by the TGA that nanoparticles do not reach viable skin cells or the general circulation, but remain on the skin surface and the outer layer of the stratum corneum. This was big news in Australia. You're probably aware in Australia we have the highest skin cancer rates in the world, so sunscreen sales are huge. And using sunscreens that contain nano zinc oxide in particular is extremely popular because it provides such a good broad spectrum protective effect, but it can also leave you quite white looking and very ghosty. So there's been a lot of nanomaterial products being launched in the marketplace. So TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, did a lot of work to check and confirm the safety of nanoparticulate size zinc oxide in Australia. So this is a very big deal. This is the big government organisation. They're probably the strictest regulators in the world, and this is their findings. They've also determined that there should be no restrictions on cosmetics or therapeutics except safe as intended. It's the chemical itself rather than the size that matters most. And again, that's got a lot to do with topical application. We're talking about cosmetic products, or in the case of sunscreens in Australia, they're considered therapeutic goods. So they're looking at topical application on unbroken skin. In the US, the FDA are taking a more cautious approach. And again, this is a good thing because they do raise some interesting questions that we need to consider, especially when we're thinking about long-term safety and use of nanomaterials in personal care products. They ask us to consider the routes of exposure. So it should be dermal only, but what about sprays and inhalation? What about oral, if you're putting nanomaterials in your lipsticks? Because you do ingest those. What about ocular, eye products? What about application over damaged skin? Okay, so you're not supposed to be advertising or using cosmetic products for use on damaged skin, but you will cut yourself, you will use product over broken skin. So they do want to check that and consider the potential safety in those scenarios. They also want you to consider uptake and absorption, penetration size, and the chemistry of the substance, not just the size, but the actual chemistry of the substance. And what about surface coatings? They ask us to consider surface coatings on particulate matter. You know, we use surface coatings to make, say, zinc oxide feel better, but then what happens if you're coating a nano-sized particulate? Is that then having an effect on delivery? And they do ask for toxicity testing, same as for all cosmetic materials. So again, to put this into perspective, if you're going to have any sort of new material in the US, you need to be considering the toxicity testing. So what they're asking for with nanomaterials is no different to what they're asking for any other new cosmetic material being launched in the US. They have a very thorough safety assessment that they recommend before launch, including physicochemical characteristics, agglomeration and size distribution in the final product, any impurities. That's obviously very important because while the substance may not be an issue, if there's impurities present, that may become an issue to consider. Again, they want to consider potential routes of exposure. They ask for dosimetry in vitro and in vivo toxicology studies, and also in vitro and in vivo toxicological data. Now again, I want to emphasise and just put this into perspective, They generally ask for these last two things on all new cosmetic materials, not just nanomaterials. So they do take a cautious approach, but again, this is a good thing to ensure safety for consumers. So the latest scientific findings in summary for you. The most important and strongest body of evidence, and again, if you'd like a copy of some of that evidence to read it for yourself, it's not just me saying it. If you'd like a copy of that, please leave me with your name card at the end of the presentation and I'll provide you with that information. This evidence has shown that nano zinc oxide particles in particular remain on the surface of the skin and are unable to penetrate to living cells of the dermis. While this particular study that they did found that zinc ions were in the blood, they couldn't necessarily relate that there was a distinct difference between the presence of zinc ions and zinc oxide particulates, so they could not directly link it to the application of nanozinc on the skin. In any case, they showed that the increase was negligible and unlikely to have any impact on human health. We need zinc. We eat zinc. So was it from our diet? Was it from topical application? Either way, it was zinc ions, not zinc oxide, that they discovered. So there was no conclusive evidence to show that topical application led to absorption into the bloodstream. Even if it was insignificantly more than dietary levels. They also concluded that the use of in vitro studies on cell cultures, macrophages and other physiological processes to suggest an effect is invalid because all of the results are void if the substance can't actually penetrate the dermis. And this is really important because even if you're going to test the toxicology of these materials in vitro, it doesn't necessarily relate to how the body's immune system or the body's own barrier mechanisms will prevent these small substances from traversing such a great distance and then penetrating. So proof that substance can penetrate dermis is required before you can consider the results of in vitro studies. And again, that's the hard part. As cosmetic chemists, we want to get active materials as deep in the epidermis as possible because we know that's hard enough, let alone getting an active material to reach the dermal layer and then pretty much impossible for it to get beyond. Remember that a lot of your actives that work in deeper layers of the skin work through communication and pathways rather than actually traversing into the dermal area. So what do you tell marketing and consumers that are concerned? Well, as I've mentioned, the internet is full of misinformation. So how do you answer all their queries? If your product contains micro or nano-sized materials, and I encourage if your product does use micro materials to still have the information there because again, consumers get very confused between the terms. Conduct appropriate safety evaluations to check for dermal penetration. Remember, if there is no dermal penetration, there is nothing to worry about. It can't get through. You don't need to worry about its effects within the body because if it can't get through the dermal layer, it can't get into the body. Examples are epiderm, transdermal or full thickness tissue studies, skin irritation testing. A great thing you can do as a company is to provide an information page, like a frequently asked questions page, to answer any concerns consumers may have about nanomaterials. You can even list, cite and provide study results. Let your consumer go and educate themselves. Counter all the misinformation with fact. A lot of the studies are probably written way above typical consumer level, but have them available so that they can make their own decision. And if you're going to use nanomaterials, make sure you provide benefits and reasons for use. Use diagrams like I've used in this presentation here because pictures speak louder than words, especially to consumers. So if you can show that your nanomaterials are going to provide efficacy to the skin and the delivery pathways, this is actually a good thing. Make sure they know that the nanomaterial is safe for them to use topically, but show them why your product is so much better because your active does get down to the stratum basale and do what it's supposed to do. That's a good thing for your product. So now let's talk about some novel formulations. How do you create some of these exciting products with that great delivery to get to the deeper layers of the epidermis? Remember first, with enhanced delivery is enhanced results. So again, as a cosmetic chemist, we want the active materials to get to where they're supposed to be doing their job. So in the case of a lot of actives, this is the deeper layers of the epidermis. But in doing so, if you can get really good delivery of your actives, make sure you're also using the actives within their recommended usage rates so that you don't get any side effects or unwanted effects from using the materials. As an example, if you're using an active material that, this is not so much a nanomaterial, but vitamin A is very tightly regulated, but it also needs a pH of around 6 to 7 to be bioavailable. I cannot count the amount of products out there that have vitamin A present and they have a pH of 5. So the material's not really working, okay? If you have a really efficacious product, you're using an active material in the right conditions, in a compatible medium, it will work well. If you can get it to deliver to the deeper layers of the epidermis, you will get great results. So make sure in getting those great results, it's also suitable and safe to use. Ideal delivery is through use of osmolytic substances. Remember, osmolytic substances will help pull actives to the stratum granulosum. That's already one of your first difficulties, getting to that mid-layer of the skin. Use amphiphilic emulsions, nanoemulsions. Now, nanoemulsions, the safest way to produce your nanoemulsions is very high levels of non-ionic emulsifiers so that you reduce potential irritancy. Make sure you check potential irritancy. Use actives and preservatives within the recommended limits and tests on humans before you launch the product. Actual humans, not a petri dish. Using nanoemulsions also ensures great stability with your formulations because you're using an excess, typically using an excess of non-ionic emulsifier. If you're selecting your emulsifiers carefully, you'll also have great stability and shelf life from your product. One of the things with nanoemulsions, anyone who's ever created them will know they do have a bit of a bluish grey appearance, which sometimes is not desirable for consumers. That's just how they appear, and that is because the droplets are so small. When they diffuse light, they take on this greyish appearance. So you may need to counter that because a lot of consumers see that as a sign of poor quality, when in fact it's generally ensuring better delivery. And of course, make sure you ensure regulatory compliance at all times. Any product you create, not just products incorporating nanomaterials or nanoemulsions. So that's the presentation on nanomaterials. A lot covered there. If you do have questions, please, you can always contact me later. Thank you.